The abdication scene in Edward II by Christopher Marlowe. The topic of this lecture is the abdication scene or Act 5, Scene 1 in the play Edward II by Christopher Marlowe. Christopher Marlowe's play Edward II, first performed during the winter of 1592 to 93, is classified as a history play and is considered to be a key text in the establishment of this genre in early modern English drama. Marlowe's major source for this play was Raphael Holinshed's Chronicles of England, Scotland and Ireland, first published about 1577, with some incidents taken from the works of Robert Fabian, the Chronicles of Fabian, 4th edition 1559, and John Stow, whose Chronicles of England first appeared in 1580 and was called the Annals of England in its 1592 edition. The historical king Edward II ruled over England from 1307 to 1330, a not so successful reign characterized by much baronial conflict and unrest. Finally, he was forced to renounce his throne on or around 25th January 1327 and later murdered in imprisonment. Act 5, Scene 1 of Marlowe's play dramatizes this abdication of King Edward II and is better known as the abdication scene, whose significance we will study in detail now. We will look into the chief issues of personal and political identity and loss that this scene raises among others, and the way animal imagery is used to describe Edward II's situation. According to Jill Barker, the play can be seen as constructed in three movements: Edward's loss of Gaveston, his loss of Spencer, and finally his loss of his own life. If we accept this division, we will see that in this progressively downward structure, the abdication of his throne is a part of the third movement that ends with the king's gruesome murder. We may note here that the movements Barker speaks of deal with Edward's losses in his personal life, whereas the abdication of the throne is necessarily a political event of great consequence that can be placed in the third movement. This is symptomatic of the king's inability to maintain boundaries in any of his relationships and his conflation of the personal and the political, which along with his pride can be considered Edward II's tragic flaw that leads to his downfall. In the very beginning of the play, we had witnessed this in his letter to Gaveston, recalling him back to the shores of England after his father's death. "My father is deceased. Come, Gaveston, and share the kingdom with thy dearest friend." This touches upon Edward's troubled identity as a man, a king and a father, which is at the heart of the play. Edward is easily swayed by his favorites, so much so that they soon become his political advisors, and he appears to have little volition of his own. He does not have any sense of any periphery to his identity and sees himself as somehow the same person as Gaveston. As he says in Act 1, Scene 1, "Thy friend, thyself, another Gaveston." He only feels real and secure when Gaveston is with him and cannot brook his absence. His fall involves his attempts to buttress his identity by surrounding himself with his favorites, each of whom he loses, at first for a short term through separation, and then at long last to death. It is in Act 5, Scene 1 of the play, or the abdication scene, that we see that Edward realizes that the name of the king, as symbolized by the crown, is invested with great significance. Although throughout the play he had abdicated the duties and responsibilities of a true king, which had angered his peers more than his same-sex passion for Gaveston, it is only in this scene we see that in an extreme reversal of opinion, and very ironically, he cannot imagine his life without his crown, which suggests that his identity is profoundly invested in his kingship. Stevie Simkin has pointed out that Marlowe is very aware of the explosive potential in his story of Edward II, given that deposition of a monarch is always a sensitive issue. Marlowe negotiates through this difficult territory in a very intelligent way by amassing evidence against Edward, which seems to suggest that he fails to rule justly. Although this might make the challenge to the king a legitimate one, the play shuttles between justification for the baron's rebellion and reassertion of the king's absolutism, and also, surprisingly, takes no definitive position on the question of the king's divine right to rule. The abdication scene is very critical in terms of Edward's identity, both as king and man, or both his political and personal entities. Forced to relinquish, he pleads, "Let me be king till night." And the consciousness that his reign is dwindling away with each passing moment is evocative of Dr. Faustus's last night on earth. He is at his eloquent and poetic best in this scene, even defiant of those who have imprisoned him. He says in line 74, "See, monsters, see, I'll wear my crown." But the hearers are indifferent to his passionate outbursts and even slightly contemptuous. In political terms, this scene has crucial implications. As Simkin points out, the crown by itself is not what Edward believed it to be, as it is of itself not invested with any power or authority. Edward's weak will, his neglect of the kingdom, his obdurate refusal to rule well and responsibly, and his corresponding impulse to solely pursue his personal, sexual, and emotional desires all contribute to creating a gap between his identity of a king and the man who inhabits that role. In this scene, we see him divested of any respect due to the monarch, and as only a man who is deeply anguished and raving and ranting like a spoilt child. When King Edward II says in the scene, "But Edward's name survives, though Edward dies," we see that for once he is displaying some awareness of the power that his family name and position has, although he never ever respected it till then, especially as he was prepared to sacrifice all for Gaveston. However, awareness does not lead to self-introspection, and he rues to Leicester. "Weigh how hardly I can brook to lose my crown and kingdom without cause," which shows his lack of consciousness of ever being in the wrong or having committed any mistake as a political ruler. These inconsistencies in thought process and opinion make it difficult for us to believe wholly what he says. The long drawn-out farewell to the crown echoes Edward's earlier farewells, the denied farewells to Gaveston and achieved farewells to Spencer and Baldock. It is thus one in a sequence of three, which may be viewed as depriving him of everything that is precious to him. Barker notes that in losing these things, Edward is stripped of identity, since he is constructed out of trappings of self and seems to have no secure internal identity. In this scene, Marlowe's use of three advisors to persuade Edward II to give up his crown is dramatically very effective, because it suggests a crowd of people trying to make him do something that he clearly wants to avoid. Moreover, Leicester as a representative of the nobility, Bishop of Winchester as a representative of the church, and Trussell as a representative of the common man function emblematically of the nation as a whole and suggest that his abdication is desired by the realm to protect its own political and civil interests. What is deeply saddening is that on stage, Edward's isolation becomes very evident, and no lengthy speech can shield him from the obvious act of relinquishing the crown. We are witness to the arbitration within Edward's own mind as he gradually accepts that he must give up the crown. Leicester puts forward the most persuasive idea. Only by abdicating can Edward II ensure that his son, Edward III, becomes the king and the crown does not go to the rebellious usurper Mortimer Jr. It is Edward II's identity and point of view of a father that the prince shall lose his right makes him finally relent to resign, although in a much tormented state. He sees this gesture not only as annihilation of identity, but even as death. The handkerchief wet with tears that he sends to Isabel is a symbol of his suffering and anguish. Before we conclude, we will look into the animal imagery that Marlowe uses in this scene. In the first portion of the scene, Edward repeatedly invokes animal imagery to describe his situation. The griefs of private men are soon allayed, but not of kings. The forest deer being struck runs to an herb that closeth up the wounds. But when the imperial lion's flesh is gored, he rends and tears it with his wrathful paw, and highly scorning that the lowly earth should drink his blood, mounts up into the air. So Edward imagines himself as a wounded lion, reacting with rage and dignity in contrast to ordinary people, imaged as deer whose wounds are easily cured. The lion metaphor is a familiar one for a king to choose to assert his dominance and power, and King Edward II had threateningly and challengingly used it earlier. Once in Act 2, Scene 2, when there was a confrontation with the barons who mocked Gaveston's second return, and then in Act 4, Scene 6, when he was captured by the barons and saw Spencer and Baldock being led away, he projected it onto his conqueror Leicester. In this scene too, he is a royal lion, the only difference being that the threat is not projected on his conquerors, but is of self-inflicted violence. Next, he imagines himself to be a bird with wings which enable him to fly up to heaven, to obtain justice for the wrongs he is suffering at the hands of Mortimer and Isabella. With wings of rancor and disdain, full often am I soaring up to heaven, to plain me to the gods against them both. In line 41, he imagines that Prince Edward is a lamb, encompassed by wolves, like Mortimer Jr. He sees Mortimer Jr. and Isabella as inhuman creatures, nursed with tiger's milk, and so as alike to monsters. Edward II in this scene, by abdicating his crown, is metamorphosing from a king to something that he cannot imagine except as death. And so, through the use of this imagery, can be said to see the rest of the world in metamorphic terms. One may conclude at this point by observing that in a scene where Edward, by being forced to renounce his crown, loses his identity, when he becomes anxious that his son will survive to be king, he protects a little of himself, as the prince will inherit both his name and kingship. To summarize, the abdication scene is very important in that this is the first scene when we are moved by Edward II's poetic and passionate outbursts and begin to pity him, which change of emotion is extremely necessary to understand his tragic circumstances as they follow and to evaluate him as a tragic persona. This is a scene which deals with his personal political identity and the loss of his political identity and his fleeting recognition of what that identity holds for him.